February 24, 2022. As Russian missiles began striking cities across Ukraine in the early hours in the morning, much of the world believed the war would be over within days. On paper, the balance of power looked completely one-sided. Russia possessed one of the largest militaries on Earth. Nearly a million active personnel, thousands of tanks, hundreds of combat aircraft, one of the world's largest stockpiles of the ballistic and cruise missiles, and a military that had inherited decades of Soviet experience and equipment. Ukraine, by comparison, was much smaller. Many intelligence assessments predicted that Kyiv would fall within days. Some governments were already preparing for the possibility of the Ukrainian government operating in exile. But history took a very different path. Kyiv never fell. Ukraine never surrendered. And as the war dragged on, the world began to realize something remarkable. Modern wars are no longer won simply by the side with more tanks, more aircraft, or bigger military budgets. Innovation matters, adaptation matters, technology matters, and sometimes a simple idea can become more powerful than the most advanced weapon ever built. Ukraine was never expected to overpower Russia. Instead, it found ways to outthink it. Time after time, Ukraine forced one of the world's most powerful militaries into situations nobody had predicted. A drone worth only a few $100s destroyed tanks worth millions. Wooden decoys fooled expensive cruise missiles. Small unmanned boats challenged one of the strongest naval fleets at the Black Sea. And commercial technology became one of the country's most valuable weapons. Today, we're looking at 5 surprisingly cheap but incredibly effective methods Ukraine has used to slow down, damage, and challenge a military that once believed was simply too powerful to stop. Because this war has proven one important lesson. Sometimes, the smallest weapon is far more powerful than the most expensive one. 1. Fake targets and camouflage tactics. One of Russia's biggest advantages during the early stages of the invasion was its ability to strike targets from long distances. Kalib cruise missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles, Kh-101 air-launched cruise missiles. These precision weapons cost millions of dollars each. But like every precision weapon, they all shared one weakness. They still needed accurate targets. Ukraine understood that weakness almost immediately. Instead of trying to intercept every missile, which would have been nearly impossible, it asked a much simpler question. What if Russia could be convicted to attack something that wasn't real? The answer came in the form of decoys. Wooden HIMARS launchers, inflatable tanks, fake artillery pieces, dummy radar systems, even entire mock military positions designed to look convincing from above. At first glance, these might seem almost too simple to work. But modern warfare often relies on satellite imagery, reconnaissance drones, thermal sensors, and rapid intelligence analysis that soldiers physically inspecting every target. From thousands of meters above the battlefield, distinguishing a well-built wooden HIMARS launched from a real one isn't always easy, especially when intelligence officers have only minutes or sometimes seconds to decide whether a target is worth striking. Ukraine exploited that pressure perfectly. Russian reconnaissance drones would detect what happened to be valuable targets. Coordinates would be transmitted to missile units. Minutes later, a cruise missile worth several $million would destroy a wooden replica. According to multiple Western reports, Russia spent a significant amount of expensive precision-guided munitions striking decoys throughout the war. That meant much more than wasted money. Every missile fired at a fake target was one less missile available to attack the real Ukrainian military positions. And while Russia celebrated the destruction of what it believed was HIMARS launcher, the real launcher was often operating somewhere else entirely. This strategy also protected Ukraine's most valuable equipment. Western-supplied systems such as HIMARS became some of the country's highest priority assets, replacing what would have taken months. Losing one could have affected entire operations. Instead, inexpensive decoys help keep them alive. Military deception is nothing new. During World War II, the Allies famously used inflatable tanks and fake armies to mislead German intelligence before the Normandy landings. But Ukraine adapted that concept for the age of satellites, drones and artificial intelligence. The battlefield has changed, the technology had changed, but the basic principle remained the same. If your enemy fires a multi-million-dollar missile as a piece of wood, you have already won that engagement. Perhaps one of the greatest lessons of this war is that victory isn't always about destroying your opponent's weapons. Sometimes it's about convincing your opponent to destroy them himself. 2. Destroying million-dollar Russian weapons with cheap drones. If future military historians ever have to summarize the war in Ukraine with a single phrase, it may be simply called the drone revolution, because Ukraine didn't just introduce a new weapon to the battlefield. It fundamentally changed the economics of modern warfare. For decades, military superiority depended on building bigger tanks, more advanced fighter jets, and increasingly expensive precision weapons. Ukraine proved that this equation no longer guarantees victory. Today, a drone that costs only a few $100s can destroy equipment worth millions. That changes everything. When the full-scale invasion began, Ukraine had very limited numbers of traditional strike aircraft. Instead of trying to compete with Russia in the air, Ukrainian engineers, volunteers, and private companies began modifying commercially available FPV drones. Originally, these drones were designed for racing. They were light, fast, highly maneuverable, and surprisingly inexpensive. But once equipped with anti-tank warheads, RPG rounds or custom-built explosive changes, they became some of the deadliest weapons at the battlefield. The principle was simple. Russian tanks were heavily mounted from the front, but the upper armor, the roof of the turret and engine compartment was significantly thinner. FPV drone operators learned to exploit that weakness. Watching a live video feed through FPV goggles, operators guided the drones directly into the most vulnerable parts of the vehicle, instead of attacking where tanks were strongest. They attacked where they were weakest. Sometimes the explosion destroyed the vehicle completely. Other times it disabled the engine, damaged the turret, and forced the crew to abandon it. Either way, a drone worth less than a modern smartphone had just taken a multi-million-dollar combat vehicle out of the fight. And tanks weren't the only targets. Self-propelled artillery, air defense systems, radar stations, fuel trucks, ammunition depots, command vehicles, electronic warfare systems. Virtually every high-value Russian asset suddenly became vulnerable. The battlefield became increasingly transparent. Any vehicle that could be seen could potentially be hit. As Russian losses mounted, Moscow began searching for solutions. One of the first responses looked almost unbelievable. Metal cages started appearing on top of Russian tanks. Originally intended to defeat top attack weapons, these improvised structures quickly became the subject of jokes online. Many nicknamed them cope cages. But behind the jokes was a serious reality. Russia had been forced to redesign one of its most important weapons because of drones costing only a fraction of the tank's self. The technological race didn't stop there. Russia invested heavily in electronic warfare. Jamming systems capable of disrupting GPS signals and radio communications became increasingly common across the front line. For a while, this system significantly reduced the effectiveness of many drones. Ukraine responded once again, this time with fiber optic drones. Instead of relying on radio signals, these drones remained physically connected to the operators through kilometers of ultra-thin fiber optic cable. Commands traveled through the cable instead of the air. That meant electronic jamming became almost useless. It was another reminder that every defensive innovation would eventually be answered by another offensive one. But perhaps Ukraine's most remarkable drone operation didn't happen near the front line. It happened deep inside Russia itself. After months of careful planning, Ukrainian intelligence repeatedly managed to move small FPV drones into Russian territory by hiding them inside civilian cargo trucks. Those trucks traveled hundreds of kilometers without attracting significant attention. Once they reached positions near strategic Russian air bases, the containers opened. Dozens of drones launched almost simultaneously. Within minutes, some of Russia's most valuable military aircraft went under attack. Tu-95 strategic bombers, Tu-22M long-range bombers, aircraft that had been designed during the Cold War and remain critical components of Russia's long-range strike capability. Some of these bombers are no longer in production. Every aircraft damaged or destroyed represents a loss that cannot simply be replaced by building another one. Military analysts around the world immediately recognized the significance of the operation. For perhaps the first time in modern history, relatively inexpensive drones had successfully threatened strategic air assets with hundreds of millions of dollars. More importantly, the attack shattered one of the oldest assumptions in military planning, that valuable assets became safe simply because they are located far behind the front lines. Ukraine proved otherwise. Distance alone no longer guarantees security. If your opponent is innovative enough, the battlefield can extend hundreds or even thousands of kilometers beyond the front. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson of Ukraine's drone campaign. The future of warfare may not belong to those who build the most expensive weapons. It may belong to those who learn how to use the cheapest ones and the smartest. 3. Forcing Russia's Black Sea fleet to retreat with unmanned naval drones. When the war began, Ukraine faced a problem that seems impossible to solve. It wasn't on land. It wasn't in the air. It was at the sea. Following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine had lost a significant portion of its navy. Many ships had either been captured, destroyed, or rendered unusable. Russia, meanwhile, possessed the dominant naval force in the Black Sea. Frigates named with caliber cruise missiles, Kylo-class submarines, large landing ships, patrol vessels, and a fleet capable of launching long-range strikes against Ukrainian cities, while also threatening an amphibious assault on Odessa. On paper, Ukraine simply couldn't compete. Building a modern navy takes decades. It requires enormous budgets, advanced shipyards, and years of crew training. Ukraine had none of these advantages. So instead of asking, how do we build a bigger fleet, Ukraine asked a completely different question. What is the cheapest way to destroy an expensive warship? The answer became one of the most innovative weapons of the war: unmanned naval drones. At first glance, they look almost too simple. Small, fast, low-profile boats packed with hundreds of kilograms of explosives. But beneath the simplicity was impressive technology. They relied on satellite navigation. High-definition cameras transmitted live video back to operators. Some could travel hundreds of kilometers across the sea before reaching their targets. Because they rode so close to the water, they produced a very small radar signature that made them surprisingly difficult to detect, especially at night or during rough weather. Unlike cruise missiles, these drones could also change direction while operating a target. Operators could steer around defensive obstacles, avoid patrol boats, and choose exactly where to strike. Ukraine rarely used these drones alone. Many attacks were carefully coordinated, while naval drones approached from one direction. Missiles or earlier drones would threaten from another. The goal wasn't simply to overwhelm Russian defenses. It was to confuse them, to force radar operators, air defense crews, and ship commanders to deal with multiple threats at the same time. And it worked. Russian warships suffered repeated attacks. Several vessels were heavily damaged. Others were sunk. Perhaps the most symbolic loss was the cruiser Moskva, Although it was ultimately struck by Ukrainian Neptune, anti-ship missiles rather than a naval drone, the sinking of Russia's Black Sea flagship demonstrated that even the largest and the most heavily armed vessels were vulnerable. From the moment on, the physical balance at the sea began to change. Naval drones continued appearing, sometimes attacking ports, sometimes targeting patrol ships, sometimes forcing Russian commanders to remain constantly on alert. Eventually, Russia made a decision that would have seemed almost unthinkable before the war. Many of its most valuable warships were relocated away from Sevastopol in occupied Crimea to the most distant port of Novosibirsk. This wasn't simply a change of location. It was an acknowledgement that Crimea, once considered a secure naval stronghold, could no longer guarantee the fleet's safety. Think about that for a moment. A country with only a very limited navy forced one of the world's powerful naval forces to reposition its fleet, not by building aircraft carriers, not by matching Russia ship for ship, but for combining creativity, engineering, and relatively inexpensive unmanned systems. The Black Sea became proof that naval warfare was changing just as rapidly as warfare on land. And perhaps one of the greatest lessons from Ukraine's maritime campaign is this: you don't always need a bigger fleet to challenge naval superiority. Sometimes, you simply need a smarter way to fight. 4. Striking Russian convoys with the Bayraktar TB2. Think back to the first months of the war. Almost every day, social media was flooded with the same kinds of videos. Long Russian military convoys, fueled trucks exploding into flames, air defense systems being destroyed, columns of armored vehicles coming to a complete stop. And in many of those videos, one name appeared again and again: Bayraktar TB2. The Turkish-made unmanned combat vehicles quickly became one of the most recognizable weapons of the entire war. On paper, the Bayraktar TB2 didn't look like game-changing aircraft. It wasn't steel drone, it wasn't supersonic, and it certainly wasn't designed to compete with advanced fighter jets. Its strengths were different. It could remain airborne for approximately 27 hours, operate at altitudes of around 27 feet, carry precision-guided ML and MAC munitions, and most importantly, it could stay over the battlefield for hours, patiently waiting for the right opportunity. During the opening weeks of the invasion, Russia faced several operational problems. Long supply convoys stretched for dozens of kilometers. Air defense coverage was often inconsistent. Logistics became increasingly disorganized, and in many areas, Russia had not yet established complete air superiority. Ukraine recognized those weaknesses almost immediately. Rather than attacking every available target, Bayraktar operators focused on the most valuable ones: fuel trucks, command vehicles, air defense systems, bridges, logistics hubs. Because military convoys don't necessarily stop when the most vehicles are destroyed. They stop when the most important vehicles are destroyed. After all, a tank without fuel is nothing more than a 70-ton piece of steel. A command vehicle knocked out at the right moment can disrupt an entire operation. A destroyed air defense system opens the sky for everything that follows. That was the true strength of the Bayraktar TB2. It wasn't about destroying the greatest number of targets, it was about destroying the right targets. As the result, the TB2 became one of Ukraine's most effective force multipliers during the early stages of the war. But its impact went far beyond the battlefield. Its psychological effect may have been one of the most important as its military one. During some of the darkest weeks of the invasion, videos of Bayraktar strikes gave millions of Ukrainians something they desperately needed: hope. For the first time, people around the world watched Russia's seemingly unstoppable military suffer visible losses almost every day. The Bayraktar quickly became more than drone. It became a symbol of resistance. Songs were written about it. Bayraktar. Bayraktar. One of them, simply titled Bayraktar, spread across Ukraine and quickly became an unofficial anthem of resistance. The song was viewed and shared millions of times around the world. Some Ukrainian families even named their newborn children Bayraktar. A military drone had become part of the popular culture. But perhaps the most remarkable story came next. As the war continued, people in Lithuania, Poland and several other countries launched fundraising campaigns to buy additional Bayraktar TB2 drones for Ukraine. Ordinary citizens donated money. Within days, millions of euros had been raised. The campaigns became powerful symbols of international solidarity with Ukraine. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of accepting the money, Baykar chairman Selçuk Bayraktar announced that the company would donate the Bayraktar TB2 drones free of charge. He asked that all of the money raised by the public be redirected towards humanitarian aid for the Ukrainian people. The decision received international attention. At the point, the Bayraktar TB2 was no longer just a successful military platform. It had become the symbol of resilience, international solidarity, and the determination of people from different countries to support Ukraine's fight for survival. Of course, the battlefield eventually changed. Russia deployed larger numbers of S-300, S-400 Buk and Tor air defense systems. Electronic warfare capabilities improved significantly. Operating armed drones became far more dangerous. As a result, the Bayraktar TB2's role gradually evolved. It was no longer seen carrying out the same kinds of strike missions as frequently as they're doing the opening months of the war. But that doesn't diminish its historical significance. Because when Ukraine needed it the most, the Bayraktar TB2 delivered both military results and something even more valuable: confidence. It showed Ukrainians and the rest of the world that Russian military was not invincible. And sometimes, the most important victory in war isn't won on the battlefield, it's won in people's minds. 5. Turning civilian technology into military power. Wars are changing. For more than a century, military power was measured by the number of tanks, the size of country's navy, or the number of fighter jets it could put into the sky. The war in Ukraine has challenged that entire way of thinking, because some of Ukraine's most valuable weapons were never designed for war in the first place. Commercial drones, smartphones, satellite internet, civilian software, open source intelligence. Technologies that millions of people use in everyday life suddenly became critical military assets. From the very first weeks of the invasion, Ukraine demonstrated an extraordinary ability to adapt. Commercial quadcopters had once been used for weddings. Real estate photography and recreational flying suddenly became recognized as platforms. Within weeks, many were modified to carry explosives. Others were used to identify Russian troop movements, adjust artillery fire, or prove real-time intelligence to frontline units. Instead of spending years developing the expensive military systems, Ukraine transferred technologies that were already available on the civilian market. Perhaps the most important example was Starlink. One of Russia's first objectives during the invasion was to disrupt Ukraine's communication. Missile strikes targeted electrical infrastructure. Cell towers were damaged. Fiber optic networks were cut. Under formal circumstances, losing communication on this scale could cripple an enemy. Without communication, commanders lose control. Artillery cannot receive updated coordinates. Drone operators lose contact. Units become isolated. Ukraine managed to avoid that scenario. Thousands of Starlink satellite terminals were rapidly delivered across the country. Instead of relying on vulnerable ground infrastructure, Ukrainian military units could communicate directly through satellites orbiting above the Earth. Frontline commanders continued coordinating the operators. Drone operators maintained stable connections. Artillery units received real-time targeting information. Even during periods of heavy Russian attacks on critical infrastructure, Ukraine managed to preserve much of its command and control network. But communication was only part of the story. Another revolutionary element of the war has been the widespread use of open-source intelligence, better known as OSINT. Never before has so much publicly available information played such an important role in an active war. Satellite imagery, traffic cameras, social media posts, videos uploaded by ordinary civilians. Even short clips recorded on smartphones became valuable sources of intelligence. Analysts from around the world began examining these images frame by frame. Road signs, shadows, buildings, tree lines, railway tracks. Every visible detail could help determine the exact location of Russian forces. Sometimes a convoy's position appeared on social media before it was already reported by military intelligence. Thousands of volunteers, researchers, software developers, and analysts became part of the global information network. Many had never served in the military. Yet their work contributed to understanding battlefield developments almost in real time. In many ways, this war was become the first truly digital war. A conflict where programmers, engineers, satellite analysts, drone designers, cybersecurity experts, and civilian volunteers all became part of the battlefield. Perhaps that has been Ukraine's greatest strength. Rather than trying to match Russia tank to tank or aircraft by aircraft, Ukraine focused on innovation. Every time Russia introduced a new countermeasure, Ukraine searched for another solution. Every time the battlefield changed, Ukraine adapted. And in doing so, demonstrated something that military planners around the world will likely study for decades. Modern wars are no longer won by firepower alone. They're won through information, technology, engineering, innovation, and above all, the ability to adapt faster than your opponent. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, many believed the outcome was already decided. The number essentially suggested that a larger military, more tanks, aircraft, missiles, resources, but wars were not fought on paper. They were fought by people, by engineers who solve problems, by soldiers who adapt under pressure, by commanders willing to think differently, and by a nation that refuses to give up. Ukraine has shown the world that military power is no longer defined only by size. A wooden decoy can defeat a multi-million-dollar missile. A drone worth a few $100s can destroy a tank worth millions. A small unmanned boat can force a powerful fleet to relocate. The final outcome of this war remains uncertain. History is still being written, but one thing is already clear. The lesson learned on the battlefields of Ukraine will shape military thinking for decades to come, because future wars may not be won by those who possess the biggest armies, but those who learn, innovate, and adapt the fastest. So, which of these 5 strategies do you think has the greatest impact on the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our new analysis. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.